We are back with the meta snapshot for patch 13.9. I think we've been making meta snapshots for around 3 years now. Every single Friday it's updated. But let's focus on what's going to be strong on this patch and figure out how to play some of the comps. So this is going to be a bit of a surprise to most because Duelists actually rose up pretty hard. But then we also have the tried and tested Sureshots and Spellslinger comps. That's going to round out the S tier for now. And then in the A tier we have Gnar Reroll. There was a small patch on May 4th, and it nerfed some of the very powerful comps that just happened to come out at the start of the patch. And that's going to be the Gnar comp and the Duelists that we talked about before. Duelists are still good, however, but Gnar definitely took a step down. We had Gnar in the S tier, but it's definitely going to take a back seat. After that, we have Threats. This is very similar to the Sureshot comp because they use a lot of the same items as them. Star Guardian Kai'Sa, that went from S to A tier. Jhin got some huge buffs, so he's definitely back. Yasuo Reroll still really good, but you need the augment for him. And then Anima Misfortune, Lasercorps, two of the trait reliant comps, built different. Another augment related comp, Infiniteam, Ashe Reroll, Jax. I thought Jax would be stronger, but right now he's definitely low A tier. Mascot, Vex, and then finally Lulu Reroll rounding out the A tier. Lulu is our new addition this week because they reworked how the Gadgeteen trait works a little bit. Now onto the B tier, we have Hearts, Lucian Reroll, Jinx Reroll, and Draven, and then finally Leblanc Hacker. So I'm going to be coming out with a video this weekend on the augments, and that's going to be posted over here on the website, BunnyMuffins.lol/augment. I'll probably release that either Saturday or Sunday for this patch. But for now, let's move on into the meta snapshot. So let's start off with Duelists. So nothing's really changed with Duelists. The comp is just really easy to play, and because everything else got nerfed a little bit, it kind of snuck up into one of the top spots. But if you've ever played Duelists in set 8.5 or even set 8, it pretty much plays the same. You just want to lock it on Nyla, maybe 2 of them, and then build up either your Vayne or your Twisted Fate, depending on what types of items you get. Some people have commented before, oh, why do you have Last Whisper on Vayne? Because she does true damage. One reason behind that is because Duelists just auto-attack a lot. So they just end up doing a bunch of physical damage anyways, and Kayle can hold it pretty well early on because she's going to be one of the item holders. Again, this comp's very easy to play, and you pretty much get free top 4s from it. It's kind of hard to get to a very good late game state, but in the early and mid game, this is probably one of the strongest comps right now. As for Duelist Spatula or Duelist Emblem holders, anyone can use it, but Bel'Veth is probably the person that could use it the best. But if you just look at the team right now, you could probably just drop it on Annie, for example. You really just care about having it for the additional trait, not so much for getting the attack speed buff. But let's move on into the how to play section. So 6 Duelists plus 2 Oxforce, that's pretty much going to be your team every single time. A lot of people wonder oh, when do I play Gangplank? When do I play Kayle? Because they're both the 1-cost Duelists, and there's 7 Duelists. Most games you're going to be playing 6 Duelists unless you get one of the emblems for an additional Duelist. So which one do you drop? Well, you typically drop Kayle because she's a great item holder for Vayne. So once you get Vayne, you just sell Kayle and then swap the items over. And you want an additional person being hit by the locket, and that just kind of has to be Gangplank in a lot of cases. Do note that we only have 7 units here, and most teams play 8 units. So who do you want to play in that last spot? Well, if you have one of the Duelist emblems, you could just play the 8th Duelist, so put Kayle back in. If you don't, you could play something like a random legendary unit, like Fiddlesticks would be pretty good, Urgot would be pretty good, things like that. But let's move on into the bottom section. So if you have AD items, itemize your Vayne. If you have AP items and Static Shiv, itemize your Twisted Fate. That's the only really thing you need to do. And also keep in mind the rolling patterns for this comp. So at level 6, you want to roll for 6 Duelists, and some of them too start to stabilize a little bit. This is going to be on stage 3-2, and then sometimes you need to roll again at 4-1 for 2-star Vayne, Nyla, and hopefully 1 Twisted Fate. This doesn't always happen, but it's just something that you should always be thinking of, and those are the major decision points for this comp. Remember, the reason why we do this rolling pattern instead of the standard leveling pattern is because this comp is very strong in the early and mid game. So we really want to just nail that down and make sure we're in a state where no one else can touch us there. But let's move on into the next team composition, which is going to be Mech Sureshot. Nothing much has changed with this build. Just remember that you could switch out Samira for threats instead. So Bel'Veth plus Mech is really good. Asol plus Mech is really good. So if you end up getting no good Samira items, you could play Samira with 1 item plus an Aurelion Soul, because they're both really good in those kind of longish fights, which the Mech kind of guarantees that you get. Also, since hackers aren't really a thing right now, I mean, they still are a thing, but they're just much more rare. It's much easier to pull this comp off because Garen's going to be your main tank in the front and pretty much absorbing all the damage for you. Contrast this comp with the Duelist comp. You are going to be definitely going for a fast 8 strategy. Well, not definitely, but it's one thing that you like kind of hope that you can do in each of your games because you're looking for a lot of 4-cost units because Garen and Samira are just by far the most important units you can get for your team. And if you're playing around the threat units, Bel'Veth and Aurelion Sol are both 4 costs as well. So you have a lot of different units you could kind of play at that point in the game. And that's going to give you a lot of options moving forward. All the item recommendations are down here. And if you want to reference this later on, after the video, for example, like let's say you finish watching all the way till the end of the video, staying to the point where I do the BunnyMuffins tip of the day as well. But then you enter a game and you're like, hey, I want to reference everything that was here, but I don't really have time to put on the video. Just head on over to the website, bunnymuffins.lol/meta. Let's move on into Oxforce Spellslingers now. So Oxforce Spellslinger, they changed Oxforce a couple of patches ago, but I think Oxforce might be kind of like the most balanced comp right now. I think it might be maybe a little above average, but when I say balanced, I think it's like the level that every comp should kind of be at. Maybe it's a little too strong right now. We are putting it in S tier overall, but it's just such a consistent team composition because you could just play so many different units in the early game. You have 2 options of carries in the late game, more if you count the legendary units. I'm just thinking about Twisted Fate and Nico. And you could play so many different variations of the build depending on what augments you get. So if you get the Oxforce emblem, you could do some really cool stuff with that. If you get Spellslinger emblem, you could go for vertical Spellslinger. You could also go for a Star Guardian build. That's also really interesting. But overall, it's just like very solid comp and lots of different options for tanks. Like for your early game, Annie's a great tank. And then in the late game, Echo's going to be the king there, along with something like a Fiddlesticks. Then for super late game, you could throw in Syndra as well. And then she just throws in all sorts of nonsense to help you get those first places. So overall, it's just like a very flexible comp. You could pretty much do whatever you want with it. The items, they're not like, nothing's absolutely required except on Twisted Fate where he really wants a static Shiv. But sometimes you don't even need to play Twisted Fate carry. So if you don't get that item, you could go for a Nico carry instead, and you'll probably do just fine. For the emblems, Echo is definitely the best holder for both the Oxforce and Spellslinger emblem. Echo just gets so tanky with Spellslinger emblem. It's actually the funniest thing ever. He gets this giant shield and pretty much no one can kill him through that. As for augments, obviously Spellslinger augment's good, Star Guardian augment's good, Cybernetic Uplink, Luden's Echo, pretty much any of those will do fine. And then for silver, sometimes the healing ones are good. Sometimes Mini Thrill the Hunt or Silver Thrill the Hunt or Celestial Blessing gives you like just enough healing because you don't really need that much on your backline carries. Oh, another low-key good one is First Aid Kit because Oxforces, they get a big shield from First Aid Kit. And Sona heals in the mid game. Annie shields herself. Echo shields himself. Alistar heals. Fiora heals. There's just sometimes Janna shields with it's like the shield weather. So you get a ton of value from that augment, and I think it's like pretty underrated right now. But let's move on into the A tier. We have the Gnar Gadgeteen comp. So Gnar Gadgeteen, it's a pretty simple comp. You just play 5 Gadgeteen and then just other random units. Before you played it with Hacker, but now you could just play it with pretty much anything. So right now, some choices could be Alistar, Morgana plus Sona. This is going to give you hearts, Mascot, and both types of penetration from Morgana. And that saves you the Last Whisper slot on Gnar, so you could fit in additional items on him. Coincidentally, all 3 of these units are also 3 costs, so you could reroll for 3 stars for Gnar, Sona, Morgana, and Alistar. But obviously, Gnar and Sona are probably more important than the other 2. With 3-cost reroll, things like Think Fast are incredibly powerful because if you ever get that on stage 4 too, you could just complete your whole board and pretty much not have to play for the rest of the game. Other good options at 4-2 are the Gadgeteen augments. They moved these so that they could only appear at those stages because it was too strong when they showed up early. But even then, the comp is still pretty solid, even though it got nerfed a little bit. Because they did get hit pretty hard by the B patch. So I'm moving it down to like maybe like S minus A plus for now. I'm leaning more towards the A plus right now. But pretty much the only thing you need are 3 Gnar items. You don't really need anything else. And we have a full list of them down here, like Titan's Resolve, Bloodthirster, Last Whisper if you're not running Morgana, Deathblade, Infinity Edge, Gunblade, Hand of Justice, all pretty solid to use. And over here, we could look at how to play the comp. So you want to stabilize at stage 3-2 at level 6. So you want at least 1 copy of Gnar. Sometimes you could get 2-star Gnar. And then if you have the emblem, put it on Sona. And then since you're looking for Gnar 3 and Sona 3, slow roll at level 7 above 50 gold. And sometimes you could hit Morgana as well. And then like, I guess if you have like infinite gold, you could go for Alistar too. But do keep in mind, if you ever randomly hit a Nunu at level 7, I know it's very rare, but sometimes it does happen, then you want to prioritize going to level 8 to fit in 5 Gadgeteen instead of looking for Gnar 3. Because 5 Gadgeteen is just still really good, and it's pretty much a guaranteed power spike, so you want to just go for level 8 instead of the 3-star Gnar. And then after you hit level 8, you could still go for Gnar after you fit in 5 Gadgeteen. And then I know that the previous version was a Hacker build, but Hacker did get nerfed. You could still play it, I'm not saying you can't, but maybe this build is a slightly bit better. On to the next comp, we have the threat build. So just remember, you could also play this with the mech comp. You just replace the front line with the mech, and then you still play Bel'Veth and Asol the same way you always do. Aatrox also got a pretty decent buff, so maybe he actually is pretty good right now. Just keep in mind, you really want to aim for this comp only if you could get the good threat hero augments for either Bel'Veth or Aurelion Sol. So the Bel'Veth one gives Bel'Veth a lot of healing. The Aurelion Sol one makes the meteors do a lot more damage, or it's the one that stuns a lot of people, and those are pretty much what you want to go for. Threat level maximum is another reason to go for the comp, but again, this is not required. It's just something that's like really, really nice. One other thing to keep in mind whenever you're playing threats, unless you get like a perfect threat game, you're probably not going to win the game, but getting top 4s should be pretty easy because normally you play this comp if you get like Asol 2, Bel'Veth 2 for free. And that kind of makes this comp a little bit harder to play because you have to be good at playing like your best board every single turn, and this comp definitely rewards those players. Stuff like Band of Thieves or anything that gives extra items is also really good for this build because you could itemize so many different units. For example, both Aatrox and Rammus can use tank items. Asol and Bel'Veth both want damage items. Fiddle wants any type of item. Urgot wants a lot of items. And then Morgana could use utility items. So literally everyone on your team could be itemized. So you have a lot of different options. So if you ever get an augment that gives a lot of items, such as Living Forge, it definitely gives you a lot more options in the game. Let's move on into Star Guardian Kai'Sa. So this comp got nerfed probably the hardest, but it's still very, very powerful. As for the core build, nothing else has really changed. It's just Static Shiv on Kai'Sa and then any other damage items on her. If you're doing the reroll variation, you want Kai'Sa 3 and Rel 3 and then sometimes Nyla 3. If you're doing the Star Guardian version, if you ever get Star Guardian Spatula, drop that on Misfortune and she's just gonna carry your entire team. You won't even need Kai'Sa anymore. You would just play her as a trait bot. And this team composition is very, very funny with Axiom Arc. I think it's like one of the cooler ones in the build. But pretty much I have the 2 ways to play down here, like the Kai'Sa reroll, we list out all the things there, and then Misfortune, if you're ever playing for her, you just play standard, and then just go for 4 cost units at level 8. Obviously, you need to stabilize at certain stages, so we go over that whole section down here. It's very similar to how you played Gnar before, but you really want to get stuff like Rel 2 Star to stabilize at 3-2, and then hopefully at least 1 copy of Kai'Sa, similar to how you wanted 1 copy of Gnar. But the core of this comp is just at least 4 Star Guardian and 2 Quick Draw. The rest is up to you. In this picture over here, we have 6 Star Guardian, and we also run Garen as a secondary tank, and then also run 3 Quick Draw. But you could throw in like a Fiddlesticks, Urgot for any of these units, and you'll probably do just fine. Next build up, we have Jhin Renegades. Wow, finally. It took a while for Jhin to kind of become meta, but Jhin is back now, so I wouldn't say he's like the best team, but Riftwalker Jhin definitely is a lot more powerful than he was before. This version you see here is a 5 Renegade build. There's a second build going around with only 3 Renegade, and then you run more of those like random units. But this comp is really nice because you could do sort of a duo carry with either Viego or Jhin. So you put your ability power items on Viego and then your attack damage items on Jhin. I tend to think you want to focus more on the Jhin because he's a little more consistent because he doesn't rely on resets like the way Viego does. But just one thing to keep in mind is that this comp is really reliant on getting 2-star Viego and 2-star Jhin, and it's very difficult to kind of get 2 specific 4-cost units up to 2-star. So you might be wondering now, like, oh, how come you list out this problem for Jhin Renegades, but you don't list this problem out for the Mech build? And you may notice Mech has 2 4-costs that they're very reliant on. Well, the difference is for Mech Sureshot, you could also go for the threat build as a secondary option with Bel'Veth or Aurelion Sol. And then the Renegade comp just simply doesn't have that backup plan. You're pretty much just hoping to hit this exact comp. If not, you're just holding onto a lot of Renegades for no reason. So that's kind of the difference between these two comps and why this comp requires a little bit more luck. Another thing that makes this comp difficult to play is that you can almost play anything beforehand, because you may notice already you don't really play too many low-cost units. It's just really Camille and Pyke, who are both trait bots. So you kind of could just play random stuff and then pivot into this team later on. So you can't really force this comp on stage 2-1. I guess if you get like Renegade Heart or something like that, or Renegade Crest at the very start of the game, maybe you could tunnel into it, but I wouldn't really recommend it that much. As for the items, Jhin's Last Whisper, i.e. Giant Slayer, is probably like one of the most typical builds, but Deathblade's also pretty good, Runon's is decent, even Rageblade isn't horrible. And then finally, you could add in a healing item like Hextech Gunblade or like a Hand of Justice. Onto Viego items, Ionic Spark, a very good item for him because he really relies on not getting stuck on a tank, and this item definitely helps with that. Titan's Resolve, pretty solid, and then like healing, general AP items, always going to be good on Viego. Lastly, for augments, I'm going to talk mainly about the hero augments because I already talked about the regular augments before, but like special shout out to high-end shopping because it really allows you to hit Viego and Jhin and the legendaries really easily. But for the hero augments, prioritize Jhin augments a little bit more because he definitely is the better carry, as we already mentioned. Next build up we have is Yasuo. So Yasuo reroll, it's pretty much the same as a Duelist reroll. It's pretty much the same as a Duelist comp, except you just itemize your Yasuo, but only do this with the Yasuo carry augment. Everything else, you just don't want to play this comp with. It is a really easy comp to play, you just kind of need the augment. If you do have the augment, this comp would be an S tier, but because the augment is really rare, it's kind of hard to justify putting this comp in S tier unless it was like by far the best comp in the game, which it is not right now. It's just very good if you get the augment. Misfortune Anima Squad is next up. So with Anima Squad, you really want to focus in on your early game because that will make or break your game. Getting those stacks during stage 2 definitely make a huge difference when playing this comp. So please only play this comp if you get the right openers for this. So I'll try to make one of those like 3-hour videos on Anima Squad, maybe sometime next week. So definitely subscribe below if you have not already for that. And I will be doing one of those like 3-hour compilations sometime this weekend, but that's going to focus more on playing like general comps, not so much focusing on one specific one. But the gameplay for this is, I do have like a example of that over here. It is on an older patch, but all the same principles still apply. But pretty much you just play vertical Anima Squad and use Jinx as an item holder. And then once you get Misfortune, sell your Jinx, find a new Jinx, and then put the items on Misfortune, and then that's all you really have to do. After that, you just throw in random legendary units. You could also drop from like 7 Anima Squad to 5 Anima Squad, depending on whether you have like 2-star Fiddlesticks, 2-star Urgot. And you could also play a lot of the random good tanks, like Garen's pretty good, Echo's pretty good. They're both like solid 4-costers. And that's pretty much all you have to do with this build. It's very simple to play, very linear, and you just keep adding more and more Anima Squad units to your team as the game progresses. For items, the only mandatory one I'd say is Spear of Shojin, but then again, sometimes it isn't mandatory. If you have 2 Archangel Staff, you actually cast at the same time as a Spear of Shojin Misfortune, so fun fact there. Obviously, the second cast would be faster if you do have a Spear of Shojin, but both builds are fine, but this one's a little bit more consistent. Lastly, don't forget to throw some like random items on your Vayne. A lot of times what I do, I build one item for my Vayne in the early game if I have like no buildable Misfortune items, and then I just leave it on the Vayne. So she ends up helping you a ton during like stage 3 and stage 4 before you get to 2-star Misfortune. And sometimes investing a little bit in your Vayne, but not too much, definitely helps out a lot in this comp. Next up, we have the Lasercorps build. So Lasercorps got nerfed a lot because the Lasercorps emblem now cannot show up in the early game, so you have much fewer chances to kind of see it. But overall, if you do end up hitting this comp, it's still pretty solid. Warwick makes great use of survivability items, and he kind of uses that to abuse the trait buff that he kind of gets. So that's why like stuff like healing's pretty good on Warwick, or just survivability items in general. There is also the Warwick carry build, as you see here. So I think if you have 5 Lasercorps, the AD build is a bit better. But if you have 6 Lasercorps, then a tankier build would do better. So all you have to do is like Edge of Night is good in both builds. But if you're playing 5 Lasercorps, do the Runon's Last Whisper as you see here. If you're doing the 6 Lasercorps build, if you're blessed enough to get that, do like Edge of Night plus Bloodthirster plus like Titan's Resolve or something like that. So kind of like 2 different things you need to worry about with Lasercorps comps. and that's pretty much going to be it. Do keep in mind, again, like if you do get Lasercorps Heart or Crown, this comp is like S+ tier, but without it, it's like low A tier, I would say. That's really all there is to it. There's also another version with 4 brawlers, and that comp is pretty solid as well. And definitely mix and match between both the hacker version and the 4 brawler version. Next up we have is the Built Different comp. Built Different, remember you could play duplicates of units, so you could play 2 Samiras, 2 Jhins, 2 Garens, 2 Echoes, things like that. And you pretty much just want to itemize your aces. So I like doing Samira the most. Secondary carry would be Misfortune if you get ability power items. But I think just focus on getting attack damage items, because if you get too many attack damage items, you could always play a second Samira and then just put those leftovers on her, or use Jhin or Bel'Veth. If you don't have Last Whisper or like a Static Shiv or Ionic Spark for your Misfortune and Samira, you could also run a Morgana to reduce the enemy resistances. Keep in mind, Prismatic Built Different is much better than Gold Built Different, but they're both obviously playable. But scrolling down to the instructions here, again, like your comp is based on what units you hit, right? Like if you have AP items, go for AP carries. If you have attack damage items, go for AD carries. So like that's why the item holder thing down here kind of could be anyone in the early game. There's no really like good instruction manual for like a Built Different comp, because it really depends on who you 2-star. But my best tip, and maybe I'll post some Built Different games if I end up getting the augment. I think I did get it a couple times this set, but I just like wasn't recording or something like that. But you pretty much just play around your 2-star and pretty much forget about everything else. That's really all you have to do. But huge item list of recommendations down here for you all to peruse in your free time. But pretty much that's really all there's going to be to it. Let's move on into the next build though, and that's going to be the Infiniteam comp. Infiniteam definitely took like a backseat recently. It just got nerfed really heavily. It's not the end of the world for it, but it's still decent. It's still playable if you get the right start for it. But a lot of its power definitely got taken away, and a lot of its power was in the early game. But since that kind of went away, this comp definitely falls into the low A tier, but it's definitely still a good option if you have the right start for it. So treat it kind of like how you play the Anima Squad comp. You wouldn't just play Anima Squad without any Anima Squad units in the early game, so just keep that in mind before you pick the Infiniteam augment in the early stages. We'll go over this when we do the augment guide sometime this weekend, so definitely keep your eyes peeled for that. But this comp runs pretty linearly. You just want to go from 3, 5, 7 Infiniteams based on what stage you're in. So in stage 2, you want to be 3 Infiniteam. In stage 3, you want to be 3 or 5. And then in stage 4, you definitely want to be 5. And then in stage 5, 5 or 7 Infiniteam. Obviously, getting to 7 is going to depend on whether you could get the spatula or not. And sometimes you just get the Ezreal off a carousel. It doesn't happen often, but sometimes you are blessed with it. And that really unleashes the power of the full comp. One weird part about this trait is that your main tank is actually Garen. It's not actually one of the Infiniteam units, and that's because Infiniteam doesn't actually improve the individual units. It just gives you an extra copy of them. So that's why like you don't need to itemize like one of the units with your traits, just because of the way the trait works. Let's go on into the next build though. That's going to be Ashe Reroll. So Ashe Reroll only take with the carry Ashe augment. I'm going to be coming out with an Ashe Reroll game this weekend during the 3-hour compilation, so definitely look out for that, because I believe we have like 2 1-cost reroll games in that series. So definitely look out for that. I won't spoil too much, but pretty much again only take this if you have the Ashe carry augment, and then just do a standard 1-cost reroll leveling pattern so you don't level up in the early game, and then on stage 3-1 roll down to 30. Hopefully you get Ashe, Blitz, and Renekton there, and then Econ back up to 50, and then roll down to 50 every single turn until you get Ashe 3-star, and then figure out a good time to all in for the rest of the units. And then 4 items, Last Whisper, mandatory, and then any attack damage item or attack speed item will work. I think Deathblade's probably the best one after Last Whisper. Runon's is pretty solid, and then like maybe Giant Slayer or Guardbreaker probably okay. But let's move on into the next build, that is the Jax build. So I made a wrong prediction. Well, it wasn't really a prediction, it was just like a hope or a guess. And I thought that Jax would be good in this patch because he was pretty good in the other patches, and then everything else got nerfed, and then Jax got buffed. But no, he's highly mediocre right now. Like, I wouldn't bother too much playing him. To play this comp, you need extra range on Jax, and he's really reliant on it. So RFC or scope weapons are pretty much the only options. I guess you could do it with the Kale Righteous Range augment also, but that one's a little sketchy because then you have to play a Kale. So pretty much only play it with this comp. So what you want to do is slow roll on level 7 in order to get 3-star Jax and 3-star Riven, and then you could also use Warwick as a secondary carry, and hopefully that will make your team do like okay. This comp really depends on when you hit your Jax 2 and when you hit your Jax 3, and also how many brawlers you could get in the early game. Brawler's trait is really strong in the early game because some teams just don't have the resources to deal enough damage to kill all of them, and then eventually one of your units is going to scale up and then win the fight for you. This comp also has a pretty strong late game. The only weird part is that like some of the champions you run are pretty bad, and that's kind of like the weakness of the build. Like you're running 2 1-cost champions in the late game, and sometimes that could be to your detriment before you get to Jax 3-star because the comp is just super reliant on that. But it's pretty much the same way you play any 3-cost reroll. So you could look at the Kaisa build to get more reference there, or just read the instructions down here, or look at the sample gameplay. Onto the next build, we have Vex Reroll, another 3-cost reroll comp. This one is just going to be 6 Mascot and 3 Riftwalker. I actually kind of wish that they buffed this comp up a little bit. There must be some way to buff Riftwalker. Maybe that would be weird, I'm not too sure. But you go for Vex 3 and Malphite 3, those are going to be your 2 main carries, and then you could add on Nasus and Pyke if you happen to get them, but Malphite and Vex are definitely the most important. So this plays a little bit oddly because you do want the 3-star Vex, but Vex is the only 3-cost unit that you care about. You don't care about Alistar, so you need to find a way to also 3-star your Malphite, and the way to do that is to slow roll either at level 6 or 7, and most oftentimes both. So if you have Mascot Emblem of Heart, you could roll at level 7. If you don't, you typically want to do it at level 6. If you ever get Malphite's Augment rock solid, then rolling at 6 is very important because then the comp revolves more around Malphite than Vex. You could also do a half and half approach. Some people, they reroll at level 6 and then wait until they have like 6 or 7 copies of Malphite, then they level up to level 7 and then reroll at level 7 to hit both Malphite and Vex. Lots of different like on-the-fly decisions that you're going to have to make with this build on when to roll and when to all in, but that kind of makes the comp a little bit interesting if you are interested in reroll comps. This is probably like one of the more difficult ones to play, I would say. But we have the other augment recommendations down here. Some item recs. For Vex, it's just blue buff plus AP and damage items. Just generic tank on Malphite and Alistar. Oh, one quick note. On Malphite tank, you want like the pure tank items more so than the utility tank items. So a utility tank item would be something like a Sunfire Cape or an Ionic Spark. Nothing wrong with those items. They're still decent on Malphite, but he benefits a lot more from pure tank items such as Warmogs. Warmogs, it only gives tanky stats. Bramble Vest, it pretty much only gives tanky stats, and Dragonclaw only gives tanky stats. Whereas Ionic Spark, it does make your tank more tanky, but it also provides a lot of utility, but not as tanky as the 3-item combo you see here. So one mistake I see players making is they build a lot of the utility tank items on their Malphite instead of the pure tank items, and then they wonder why their Malphite kind of melts. Instead of being like a rock, he's kind of like paper with those builds. And not saying that those items are never usable on Malphite, they definitely are. It's just that you really prefer the pure tank items. Next build up we have is Lulu Reroll. So I love this description. This is basically Hearts Reroll version 2, but just going to name it Lulu Reroll to give her a little respect. So the tier list is made with Void Sin, and you all can get coaching from him if you want. If you look at the top, you just like click the coaching section here to get more info on that. And again, this is on the website bunnymuffins.lol/meta. Let's go back into the Lulu comp. I just thought that description was pretty funny. So you could play this with either the Lulu carry augment or either of the Pantheon augments. Obviously the Lulu one's going to be a bit better, but you pretty much build a lot of blue buffs. Lulu and Sona, great users of blue buff, and you just play this like a 1-cost reroll with supers. I actually don't think there are many supers comps right now, so maybe this comp definitely is pretty solid because no one's going to be contesting the Lee Sins, the Malphites, the Gangplanks, things like that. Probably my favorite part about 1-cost reroll comps is the fact that you don't need to have an item holder because you just use your main carry as your item holder the whole game, so you don't have to worry about switching over or making decisions like that. I think that contributes to part of the reason why reroll comps are a bit easier, because there's a little bit less decision making. The only major decision is when to go for the comp in the first place and then when to all in for the comp. After that, that's really all you have to decide. But yeah, to play any 1-cost reroll comp, you do not level up, you just build a huge econ and then roll down at level 4 at stage 3-1 to 30 gold. And then after that, you econ back up and then slow roll at level 5. After that, if you hit one of the 3-star units, you could look to level up to level 6 to play 4 heart, or roll a bit more in level 5, but just make sure you get that power spike later on. It's going to depend on your life total. And then hopefully you find everyone else there. So Lucian and Malphite, those are definitely going to be easier to find at level 6, so just keep that in mind. Whereas the 1-cost units, Lulu and Pantheon, it's going to be much easier at level 5. B tier, we have the other heart reroll comp. We have the Lucian reroll. These comps are just like much weaker right now. It's never your first choice. But hey, if you start a game with like 5 Lucians, maybe you go for Lucian reroll. Next up, we have Jinx reroll. And then after that, we have Draven reroll. Draven kind of took a backseat also. Not saying you could like never play these comps, they're just much weaker right now. And then lastly, Leblanc Hacker, probably in the do not play unless you like really know what you're doing. But let's move on into the items. So bow's still pretty solid, sword's still pretty solid. If you just look at a lot of the top comps, like bow is used in everything. Duelists can use bows with like rune-ons, any Vayne items, static shiv on Twisted Fate as well. If you look at the Mech Sureshots build, bow is used for Last Whisper. That's a required item on Samira. And even though if you're forcing mech, you'd probably prioritize tank items more, just getting the bow to like flex into other stuff has a lot of value. Spellslingers, you want the static shiv, so a lot of comps can use bow. So it's just really hard to get if everyone's kind of going for it. So if you get one at the start, it makes your game a lot easier. After that, I'd say right now items are pretty flexible. Even like these bottom tier items, Rod and Chain, you still could build lockets for the Duelist build, so it's very, very powerful there. The only thing I'd want to avoid is Glove. So with defensive items, with the Negatron, Belt, and Chain, you could go for like Mech. With the Chain, you could go for Duelists. Rod, you go for like Spellslingers or Duelists. Bow, you pretty much go for anything. There's like a ton of options in the game right now, so don't stress too much if you get the wrong item at the start of the game, because it really doesn't change that much about how the game's going to play out, as long as you kind of know what you're doing. But now it's time for the BunnyMuffins tip of the day, and my fun fact for today is that in the mech build, Fiddlesticks, if you end up playing him in the late game, benefits from the 2 mech units dying at the start of the fight. So little bonus there if you are a Fiddlesticks connoisseur. But that is going to be it for me today. Hopefully you all enjoyed this video. Augment Guide going to come out either on Saturday or Sunday. And then the 3-hour Unranked to Diamond compilation will be posted on Saturday or Sunday as well. I'm not sure of the order yet, depends on when I finish recording. But hopefully you all enjoyed this, and I'll see you all in the next video.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to share and subscribe. And of course, smash that like button. Each like is an LP I gain before the next video.